Welcome to my Bob Thurman podcast. I'm so grateful some good friends enabled me to present them to you. If you enjoy them and find them useful, please think of becoming a member of Tibet House US to help preserve Tibetan culture. Tibet House is the Dalai Lama's cultural center in America. All best wishes. Have a great day.
This podcast bonus was originally recorded October 23rd, 1998.
I'm very happy to be here with you in this beautiful state, and in a Christian institution. I think that is a wonderful thing. And talking about the Buddhist path to the spirit. I guess we have to start from the beginning. We have to start with enlightenment, and to do that, I think that we can sort of combine that with history. So what I thought I would do tonight is I would start with enlightenment, the beginning of Buddhism and the end of Buddhism, and then go something to the history of India and Tibet and how it got to be the centerpiece of Tibetan civilization, and then perhaps rehearse or go through the path, so you can sort of get a view of what they think of as the path to enlightenment, or the path of enlightenment. Beginning first with the Buddha. Now, Shakyamuni Buddha lived about 2,500 years ago, although nobody really knows exactly when, but the best guesses are about 2,500 years ago, roughly contemporary with the pre-Socratics, with Confucius, with a little later than Zoroaster, in North India. Actually, where he was born is currently Nepal. And he was a prince who lived a very luxurious life as a youth. His father had received a prediction that his son would either conquer the world or he would become an enlightened, penniless sage. So the father decided he preferred the world conquest option, and was told that in order to ensure that the world conquest option was what happened, he should make sure that Buddha wasn't unhappy about anything ever. Prince Siddhartha, his son, never got unhappy about anything. So he arranged things where Prince Siddhartha had a very, very happy life, and for his first 29 years, and he was happily married, and he had a beautiful son, and he was a master of all the arts of governing, and the arts of war, because in those days a king had to be a warrior, had to lead armies, and was a general and organizer of people. And he excelled at all of these things according to the story, the legend or the story. And but he had this tendency to be reflective, and he had this tendency to want to save lives rather than take lives. And this worried his father, and whenever the Buddha would be couldn't be found around the house, there would be big alarms sent out of where did he go. And because his father was afraid he would go into trance or attain samadhi or start becoming holy, and that was the last thing the father wanted. So however, Buddha finally did manage to break out of the palaces, the summer palace and the winter palace and the autumn palace. There are different versions of the story. The later ones are more elaborate than the earlier ones. And he finally broke out, though, and he saw, for the first time in his life, he saw an old person. He had never seen an old person. He'd only seen young and handsome and beautiful people. And he was shocked at this and said, "What is this?" And his charioteer told him, "Well, this is what happens to us all." That was a big shock to him. And then again he went out, he saw a sick person, which he'd never seen, because whenever anyone would get sick, they'd be taken away from his presence, and he would never had seen sick people, supposedly. And then finally he saw a corpse, a dead person, and that was a big shock to him. And last of all, he saw an ascetic, a wandering seeker of truth, what they called a shramana, in Sanskrit, a wanderer, a one who seeks refuge from the sufferings of ordinary living. And he felt that Shramana had a special light about him, which he was very happy about because he had been truly concerned by sickness, old age, and death. And he thought there must be some way to do something about this type of thing, you know, and find out what is the cause of this, or how to escape from it, or how to protect people from it, or what have you. He'd been brought up as a kid to be a king, and he had been brought up thinking that his role in life was to protect people. And then he felt, however, that when you can't, what good does it do to have a kingdom and a defense force and what have you, an economy, if everyone gets sick, grows old, and dies anyway? So when it came down to when his son was born, according to some versions of the story, in some only when his wife was pregnant, but anyway, when he was about to have a son, the father said to him, okay, now I'm going to, by the Brahminical theory, then when you have a grandson, then you can retire from whatever you do, and then your son takes over whatever the family business is. So he said, okay, now you're going to have a son, and or now you've had a son, and now I'm going to retire from the kingdom, and you have to serve Siddhartha, and you have to run the kingdom. And Buddha said, sorry, Dad, you'll have to wait a little longer to retire. I'm going to myself retire to the forest. I'm going to become a seeker of enlightenment, and when I come back, I'll clue you in on it. And Dad said, what are you talking about? I don't want to be clued in on any such thing. I want to retire and take a break. And so then he did the thing that fathers will do in such circumstances, which is he had his son locked up. And but then, the gods came in and intervened in the mythical thing, The gods wanted the Buddha to attain enlightenment, so they intervened and they helped him sneak out, which he did. Went out and he meditated in the forest, and he spent 6 years studying with different yoga teachers, actually one by one rejecting their versions of the teaching of ultimate reality, but trying them out, and mortifying the flesh, sort of doing tremendous ascetical ordeals to sort of counterbalance his tremendous hedonistic luxury lifestyle of a young prince. At the end of that, he renounced doing that. He said, that's no good, all this mortifying of the flesh doesn't get you anywhere. And he went and sat down under a tree, and some goddess brought him a bowl of frozen yogurt from heaven, a heavenly frozen yogurt, and his body immediately filled out and his skin turned gold, and then all his friends who were the fellow mortifiers of the flesh were mad with him, and they left and said, he's a cop-out, the guy eats ice cream, he's no good. And so he was all alone there, and he said, I'm going to not move from this place, even my bones can wither, whatever, I'm not going to move from here until I know what the meaning of life is, what is reality, I'm going to discover that. So then, he sat there, and it is said during the night, the first thing he remembered was all of his previous lives, infinite billions and millions of lives where he was all different kinds of animals, and he was a god, and he was in hells, and he remembered his infinite evolutionary past. And then he became aware of all of the paths and future paths and pasts and futures of all the other living beings in the world. And then he was able to know all their thoughts, and then he was able to know all the different realms of the universe and so forth. And finally he came to a direct realization, at least this is the amazing claim on which Buddhism is founded. He came to a complete knowledge of the nature of reality, basically. He did not, in fact, as religious prophets do, he didn't meet God, or he wasn't invested with a mission by God, so to speak. He did not discover that there was an omniscient mind controlling the universe. He did not. He discovered himself the total knowledge of the nature of the universe. In other words, he made an exact experiential, like he saw the atoms, how they worked. He saw subatomic particles. He saw far galaxies. He saw how the human mind and the human heart works, etc. He attained a virtual omniscience, and he then also, in that attainment, he also noted that there were millions, infinite numbers of beings in other universes. There were infinite numbers of enlightened beings. There were infinite numbers of gods, and every kind of being. And he also became aware of that. So in a way, he did become kind of aware of a force of enlightenment and love in the universe, but not just, it wasn't something disconnected from the universe or out of the universe. It was perceived by him as the strong force, you could say, of the universe. And he was very happy, and it was said the earth quaked, and all the deities came, and the devil actually came, Satan, which they call Mara, and some say the Buddhists invented Satan, actually, I don't know if you know that. but he was called Mara in India. And this Mara came there and tried to persuade him and tempt him and lead him astray, and he wouldn't be led astray by Mara. Then Mara went drat, and went away like one of those silent movie characters. And so he had this whole thing. But the key of what he understood is not that mysterious. And so I want to start by letting you know kind of sort of basically what it is. And by definition, I don't pretend that I know what it is really, but in a really visceral way, but I can tell you by definition what it is. He discovered that the problem he had been having, and that all beings have, and that the cause of all the suffering in the world is misunderstanding, actually. It is misknowledge. People often usually say ignorance, but it's not quite ignorance in the normal way we understand ignorance, in the sense that it's not just a failure to know something, like some quantum of information. What it is, it's an actively wrong knowing of everything, a misknowledge of the world. And the essence of the misknowledge is a very simple one that we can all immediately understand. Here now in this room, every one of you knows for sure one thing, right? You're all children of Descartes. For example, you have it put for you perfectly, therefore you know that you are there. And you know who you are, right? If anybody for a moment didn't know who they were, you'd be nervous. You'd think something was wrong. And so I'm me. I'm this and that. I can show you. I got a driver's license. I'm a human. I'm a this. I'm alive. I'm many things. And that's me. Right? And you know that. And that is actually wrong in a way. Unfortunately. Not completely wrong, but wrong enough to cause all of suffering. And in what way? And why does it cause all of suffering, you see? Because in a way you're totally shortchanging yourself. When you say you know who you are, you mean, of course, you as distinct from me and from everyone else. You as a sort of intrinsically real, sort of fixed thing that is always there to when you go me, it lands on you, right? It's like you're there. It's like one of those little high school charm bracelets that says, Bob on it or Annabelle, It's like hanging somewhere in your soul, and that's you, and you know that that's you. Right? And you know that that's not the rest of the universe. You know that. And no one else is you, right? And because you know that, you are in a completely impossible situation, aren't you? Because why? First of all, subliminally, you don't like to think about it all the time, but you know that everyone else in here doesn't agree with you that you're the real thing here. And the main thing, each one of you also thinks that not only do you know who you are, but you know you're the main thing here. The fact that you came here is the most important thing that happened here. You drove and you got the ticket and you came and you did it, and you're really the real thing that's here. You're not sure. The other people could be cardboard dummies, They could be holographic projections sent here by the mad scientists, But you're here, and that's the main thing, right? But then you secretly know everyone else has the temerity to think that they're the main thing. And therefore they kind of are contesting your centrality here and your importance. And they know they're real. They don't know even if you're real, you see. And so while things are nice and the weather is good and there's enough food and we're in a comfortable economy and there's no war and no Bosnia and no what have you, that's not too difficult. We have courtesy. We sort of pretend not to be thinking we're the main thing, and we sort of say, after you, and let me hold the door, and you first, and, you have a share. And now and then we fall in love with someone, and temporarily we think they're the main thing. Or we have a child, and we think that, unfortunately, a little less temporarily, we have to deal with them being the main thing. But still, we then will revert to us being the main thing, and then the whole universe is therefore really on some deep level against us, and we are against the universe. And with us being against the universe, Buddha noted, Buddha had been against the universe, it had been against him, and he realized that you lose when you are against the universe, and it is against you. The universe is time, and time makes you grow old, and you get sick, and you die. The universe is other people, and you can't contest with them forever. They will wear you out. And then death will come along, and you will die, and you will lose complete control when you die. And you don't know what will happen to you after that. You dream up many hopeful fantasies, but you don't know, and it's terrifying. And so all of this suffering comes from this situation of being you pitted against the world. Now, Buddha didn't just say, okay, that's a bad scene, so we'll just change it and we won't suffer, as if it was arbitrarily doable like that. That would have been useless. What he wanted to know was, the reason he went off to seek is that he wanted to know if this really is the situation. I think I'm me, I think I'm the main thing, but is that so? Am I the main thing? This was what he was out to discover. And what he discovered was, first of all, I want to say right away, he did not discover that he did not exist. That was not what he discovered. It's very important to make that, because people always misunderstand Buddhism to think that the big eureka, Buddha's big eureka was, wow, I'm so happy because nobody's home, That would have really been an idiotic thing, and the Indian people are very intelligent, and some guy jumps up and says, Eureka, nobody's home. They would have said, then get lost. Why should we listen to somebody who doesn't exist? So that was not what he discovered, but although he sometimes would say, basically, I don't exist, or you don't exist, or I don't have a self, he would say that. I have no self, my self doesn't exist, your self doesn't exist. He would say it just to kind of shock us, in the sense that the way we think we exist, we don't exist in that way, as the main thing, as the central thing, as an unchanging, fixed thing apart from the rest of the universe, as an absolute thing even, we don't exist. That's what he wanted to kind of jolt us into being aware of. Because unfortunately, when our sense of self-importance, our egotism, our egocentrism, is based on a delusion of a miswiring in the core of our program that we are something absolute about us. That we as personalities are absolute things, you see. And therefore, that then pits us in the sense against the absolute world, which is against us, right? So what he realized was that he didn't realize that he didn't exist. And he realized that his sense of himself as existing as an absolute thing was a mistake. And then he realized that between these two extremes of being an absolute self and being non-existent at all, a non-existent self, between those two extremes there was a way of being a relational self, a pure nexus of relationship, totally interconnected with all other things and beings. In a sense, not really different from the universe, not one sort of thing like the whole universe melting into a cosmic sludge or something, the way people wrongly think mysticism is a big thing of thinking the universe is all one big soup or something. That was not at all his vision. His vision was there is relative and relational differences, but ultimately these differences dissolve and there's kind of an ultimate unity. So there's ultimate unity and relational difference simultaneously present. And that made him really happy for some reason. Somehow the burden of being stuck with this absolute confrontation between your absolute self and the absolute other universe was just too much. The way he understood it, it is what really makes us tired. It is why at the end of 12 hours of waking consciousness we can't wait to pass out and go to sleep and just not be there, because being sort of holding ourselves up against the universe somehow and all of the things and the stimuli and the ideas and the problems coming, it gets too tiring. Whereas when we know that we and the universe are sort of interconnected, our relative difference becomes much easier to bear. We can somehow deal with it. We somehow connect with it, you see. So that's basically it, okay? It's not very mysterious, isn't it? Isn't it simple? That's all enlightenment is, really. It is being connected, realizing your interconnectedness with all things, and realizing your relationality with all things, really viscerally realizing that. Because once you are not an absolute thing apart from things, then also other beings you become more preoccupied with others. What is there so great about yourself to be so focused on and self-preoccupied with all the time? The sort of root of narcissism and the self-preoccupation and what the Buddhists call self-cherishing dissolves in a certain way. You become transparent to yourself. Once you become transparent with yourself, you become bored with yourself. Because you sort of can see through yourself. You realize you are interconnected with others, and you also realize you are very fluid and flexible, and if you let yourself go, you can become more and more negative, and your states of being can become negative. If you cultivate yourself creatively to be a vehicle of love and compassion and joy, you can be infinitely loving and compassionate and joyful, because you are a relational process. There's nothing fixated about you. So then this is called sort of the realization of wisdom and compassion. Wisdom comes from seeing through the self in a certain way. Not that you don't exist, but that you are relational, you are permeable, you are interconnected. And then compassion arises from that, because then you come to realize, as Shantideva says, that you and other beings are but the limbs of one life. And therefore, just like, for example, and that compassion is not some sort of sentimental and great saintly thing, it becomes a natural thing, just like when your hand touches a hot object or goes to the fire, you pull it away, and you don't say, I'm so compassionate to my hand, not letting it burn in the fire. You just remove it from the pain because you feel the pain. So similarly, when you become transparent to yourself, all beings somehow become transparent to you, and you feel their feeling in this new way, though, of not so concretized. You feel it in a kind of virtual way where you can bear to feel it, but then you become committed to them not having bad feelings, which is called compassion, and you become committed to them having good feelings, which is called love. So if you take the analogy, so why Buddha was happy was, if you take the analogy of someone being happy when they're in love, before something has gone wrong, that time of being in love when your identification of self expands to incorporate the beloved. And even the beloved becomes the most important part of the self, in a sense. You want the beloved to be happy most of all. And there's this exhilarating, wonderful feeling of forgetting about yourself and really focusing on the beloved, like a newborn child. It doesn't have to be romantic, only like a newborn child, the beautiful little thing, cutest little thing in the universe, right? We've all had them, held them in our arms, But what happened to Buddha was, when he became transparent to himself, every being looked like that beautiful child in his arms. Every being was like part of himself. His identity expanded to include the feelings and the hearts and the minds of all of the beings. And he fell in love with all of them. And he was also encouraged that, just as now, by realizing his freedom from this absolute selfhood, and finding tremendous joy and release in that, every single one of them was due to find that, and could find it. They could learn it just as he had learned about it. They could learn, study themselves, study reality, concentrate, focus, develop, and eventually realize their own freedom from this imprisoning, distorted, absolutized selfhood. And through that freedom, then really feel real love for beings and universal love for beings, and really achieve happiness. Is that clear? Good. So that's where Buddhism came from, that he had that experience. As I wrote a paper a little while ago, it was published in a Notre Dame collection of philosophy things, entitled The Buddha's Smile. And this smile is what I have been getting grateful for more and more as I grow older. Because the claim is, you see, not that I really can verify it or know it, but anyway, the claim is that Buddha attained this total exact knowledge of the nature of reality, and then he smiled. Imagine attaining the total exact knowledge of reality and going, oh no, what a bummer, what an awful scene, type thing. That would be worrisome, wouldn't it? But he smiled because he saw that the sentient condition was fixable. The sentient condition was really on the threshold, and especially the human condition amongst the different sentient forms, actually human and certain types of deity forms, certain types of gods or angels, or there's many different layers and levels of heavens in the Buddhist universe, many different gods and goddesses and angels and different things, and certain of them are so sybaritic, they live in these like cosmic jacuzzis like 1 billion miles across with these diamond bodies and things, and they're just so like self-indulged that they're hopeless, they can't think of a thing until they die, which takes billions of years. But some of them are a little more balanced and more like humanoid, and then they're able to reflect on these things and come to these understandings. So certain types of humans and gods have this wonderful capacity of becoming self-reflective and actually investigating, and this highly cultivated intelligence and imagination and empathy that they can actually achieve this wisdom and compassion. They have already, each one of them has evolved infinitely in the past to be able to truly achieve it. He saw that. So therefore he was optimistic. He smiled because he was happy, and he saw that beings could achieve that same happiness as he had. And then he felt that he would help them with it. But then he started out in a wonderful way. The first thing he said to them was, well, not quite the first thing, but anyway, something that he constantly repeated was, don't necessarily believe me, what I say. Yes, I did understand now I'm a Buddha. There is such a thing as a Buddha. If you feel maybe that there's some kind of different way of being in the world, that's good to inspire yourselves. But don't necessarily believe everything I say. Because if you believe what I say just because I look cute like I'm a Buddha, then you'll believe some idiotic thing some other person says who may be more cute. Because you don't really have a reason to believe what you believe. So don't depend on authorities, was the first thing he said. First he said, I know everything, but then don't believe what I say, because then you'll become dependent on authorities. The real authority for you, because you are this marvelous being who has self-reflective awareness, the thing for you to depend on is the authority of your own experience, the authority of your own reasoning, the authority of your own heart. That's what you should. Not that every prejudiced opinion in your heart is necessarily correct. You have to examine, you have to correct, you have to evolve and develop. But deep down there's something in you that you can believe. And then you can take this and that and practice and try it and experiment. But then finally you are the one to judge. Rely on yourself. He was very, very big on that. Because he had to do it himself. He had to go against what his father told him to do. He had to go against what the priest told him to do, about be a king and stay in the world and do all this. He had to get out of the chariot and go and seek this truth, this reality, this truth, in order to find his freedom, and then be able to share it with others. So he doesn't want to then impose that authority on others. That is the useful thing. So then he... How to help people get this? Well, he became a teacher. Actually, the most important name for Buddha in Buddhism is Shasta. And Shasta means teacher. And teacher is a very consciously chosen word. It is not a guru, not the word that was in India at the time, authoritarian or authoritative guru. It was Shasta, which means teacher, which means one who brings out, like our notion of a liberal arts teacher, one who brings out in the hearts and minds of others their own innate potential to understand themselves and their lives, to do something for others, to find the meaning of what they're doing, and to enjoy that, to enjoy the privilege of such a free and well-endowed human life form as we have. So a teacher is not an indoctrinator. A teacher is not an authoritarian enforcer of dogmas in this view, you see. And that was the most important name for the Buddha, so he needed to found a school. And I'm nervous because we have the president here, and I never like to tell this when there's university presidents around, but he realized that schools are very hard to fund, and that kings, the social authorities of the day, don't necessarily like schools that teach opening of the heart, that teach enlightenment. They don't mind trade schools. They don't mind military academies. They don't mind cooking schools for the ladies. But they don't want schools that will make someone realize their own true potential, because they realize then many people might not want to serve in the armies or the kitchens or the bedrooms or wherever the different people have to serve, or the fields. So he was very clever. So he went to the kings and said, look, our guys don't want big salaries. I don't want a salary. I had a kingdom. I didn't want that. I'm not going back to it. I don't need a big fancy building. What we need is a free lunch. Every day we need one free lunch. We don't need a free dinner. We don't need breakfast. Just lunch. And then every time you give us a free lunch, we'll give you a little lecture, if you like. And the king said, that doesn't sound too bad. And so, great. So that was establishing the Sangha, the monastic Sangha. And then, by the way, if you have like a little garden or a park or an old shed somewhere, we can stay there in the rainy season. And in the dry season, in the good weather, we can stay outdoors and camp in one of your gardens or groves or something. Just have people not bother us. And then we'll come in and we'll beg, and you give us lunch, free lunch. And then that's it. We won't own property. We'll be celibate. We won't procreate. We will just devote ourselves to enlightenment, and you guys will get the pleasure of giving lunch to us, and we'll give you a cheerful talk or tell you a story or entertain you in some way. So that was the bargain on which the first liberal academy was founded. And this burgeoned very rapidly because a lot of people in Indian society realized that it was more fun to get a free lunch and then become enlightened than it was to fight in the army, to bear 15 children, to wash all the dishes, to do all the other things that they had to do. And of course, he didn't accept people who were just trying to get out of work. They had a few tests, and criteria. And but it still grew very, very rapidly. And actually, his former wife, who was almost the last person to convert to this new insight, because she was so mad with him when he left her and their son, when the son was newborn, that she just, she was really bugged. But finally, she herself, when she met him, and when the son met him, the son just walked near his body, and when the shadow of the Buddha fell on, the son actually came to play a cruel joke on the Buddha, because the mother said, okay, go see your dad, when he finally went back to his home kingdom, and ask him for your inheritance, she said. And of course that was cruel because he was penniless, you see. So the son was a little nervous about it. He went to see the glorious Buddha, his father. He said, Dad, I'm your son Rahula. And he was around 20 at that time. He said, Mom says I should come and get my inheritance. So Buddha just said, Ehi bhikkhu, come here, seeker. And then the son walked near to him, and then when the son walked into his shadow, the son achieved enlightenment. Total and perfect freedom from suffering, and total insight in nirvana, actually. So then Buddha said, how's that? He said, that's all right, eureka, that's great. And and apparently somehow when you have the experience of freedom and enlightenment, all of the struggles and the travails of getting there seem to sort of dissolve, because it's a kind of strange experience where once you have it, once you experience it, you realize that you always did have it, and that you were just distracting yourself from an awareness of it in a certain way. It's hard to explain, but they say anyway that it's because it's not something that you newly create. It's coming to an awareness of what is uncreated, what has always been there, what is the ground reality of the universe, and sort of becoming one with that reality and embracing that in your experience and feeling embodied in that ultimate reality, and therefore finally stable and secure, without that embodiment and stability and security eradicating your ability to responsibly and lovingly and tenderly interact with beings in the world. So then this Sangha grew and created this alternative society in Indian society. And within a couple of centuries, the emperors even were coming around to funding big institutions like Trinity Colleges all over the place. And the Sangha, the community. But the reason I don't like to tell college presidents is, of course, the faculty worked without salary. See, that's why it was so cheap to run the place. And they could spread them so well. But I hate college presidents to get that idea. So anyway, it grew enormously in India, and it emphasized in its first 500 years in India the principle of the individual using their precious life to achieve freedom from suffering and achieve enlightenment. And so it was monastic, and main emphasis was monastic. And the monastic element was crucially important. And I'm an ex-monk, and therefore Dalai Lama laughs at my way of presenting Buddhist history, or the history of, which is not just Buddhist history, actually history of the planet, because I had a kind of eureka experience of my own 10 or 15 years after having ceased being a monk, that actually the monastic institution is the only institution in human history that has effectively sometimes protected the individual against the militaristic power of the state, east and west, irrespective of what religion it involved with. The sort of coercive, authoritarian, collectivist, and militaristic power of the state, the individual family has never been able to stand against it throughout history. The state has always submerged the family, killed them off, threatened to kill the children, and therefore they always control them. But monastics get to a certain macho level of sort of counter-military militancy, where at different times in history they have managed to protect individuals from the state, and they have been a break on the totalistic power of the state wherever they have existed. And I was shocked to rediscover that, because I thought somehow it was something useful in the past, but we don't need it now, since I'm an ex-monk. But you can read that in my Inner Revolution book, my thesis about monasticism, which is kind of a sociological and historical thesis, and I have a lot of detractors and a lot of debates still to go through with it, but I think it actually is correct, and valid. Obviously I do. And I'm ready to argue with anybody about it, too. I got the insight from answering the challenge of a Columbia sociologist before I worked at Columbia, who said, who was chiding the peace movement, although he himself was a peacenik, a sort of Chomsky-ish type, and he was saying, you guys, you go and do a protest once every few years, you put some flowers in some gun barrels, you think you've done a great thing, and then you go back to your day job. And then the war movement, they go back to their paid salary jobs in the war industries and in the military. And then therefore, where's your institution, not just as an individual for the occasional, protesting the occasional outrage, But where's your institution that is a peace movement that is there all the time to stop the war movement, or to balance it, or even put a brake on it, on its momentum? And then I was shocked by that, I remember, and I thought and looked, and where is it in history? Anywhere. The institution. Then I realized, and then you think of, well, okay, we'll get a foundation, and then the foundation will be as big as the Pentagon in the United States, and we'll have to have $100,000 salaries for everybody, and forget it, right? Trillions it would take to build a counter institution like that. And then I suddenly realized, wait a minute, of course they had such an institution at different times in history, and they didn't have to have trillions because the people did it for nothing. But they were soldiers of peace. Actually, they were ready to live and die for Christ or Buddha for peace, and they wouldn't fight, and they would stand against soldiers and swords with this sort of vision of a spiritual thing that gave them power, fearlessness of life and death, just equal and opposite to, and perhaps even more powerful than, finally, the fearlessness of life and death that the soldier gets jacked up into based on hatred. But anyway, that was, but see, well, it's nice to clap, thank you, and I mean, not me, because I'm an ex-monk, but for all the many thousands and millions of monks throughout history who did bring peace for little periods of time and created a little bit of asylums in different history, in different societies, East and West, never mind which religious ideology. They do deserve that applause, but then, by discovering this was not a comforting discovery, as you'll see when you read My Inner Revolution, because when you look at today, monasticism is effectively destroyed on the planet. And, hey, lo and behold, the counter-institution to monasticism, militarism, is totally in charge of the treasure of the planet, basically. The major investment of everybody in the planet is militarism. Even poor countries that can't feed people, that can't prevent their diseases, they're buying these weapons from Southern California. We are selling them the weapons, our people, madly and wildly, hand over fist. So where would be the monastic counter? Where would it come from? How could it work? It seems very difficult, actually. How do I really do it? And then I'm an ex-monk, so I'm not helping, except pointing out the difficulty. So anyway, so then the first 500 years was emphasizing that in India, and it was tremendously successful in India, and it helped calm down the sort of imperial quest in India. And the Emperor Ashoka, who did, at least legendarily and apparently, become a Buddhist after a certain level of conquest. This is an emperor whose grandfather destroyed the armies of Alexander the Great and beat him back from India. So they were not peaceniks, these Indians at this time. But anyway, this emperor, he became peaceful, and he did not do like Hannibal and attack Iran and attack the Mediterranean. He spread the Buddhism, he spread this monastic institutional ethic in his country, in his empire, which was the huge, wealthiest empire in the world at the time, the Empire of India. And then once he had done that, about 500 years after the Buddha's time, there was a big emphasis, then this monastic institution was secure, and India was more developed and refined, and people had become a bit more gentle and somewhat less militaristic. And then it became safe and appropriate to develop a more powerful social ethic. And the Mahayana Buddhism arose, interestingly and auspiciously, very much around the time of Christ in West Asia. And it arose on a very strong gospel of love and compassion and universal, called the Mahayana, the universal vehicle of love and compassion, and transform the world into a Buddha land, as they would say, and bring everyone up into, and love all beings, make them happy, etc. And so the emphasis was not only on your own liberation through monasticism into enlightenment, but it was on transforming the world into an enlightened realm. And that had its run for about 500 years. Although it didn't crush the monastic, it increased the monastic more, because it used it as it was one of its important methods. So it was not anti the monastic, actually, as it's been wrongly presented sometimes. It was building on top of the monastic. So then that happened, and then after 500 years, this third wave came, which scholars up until now have mainly considered a kind of terrible degeneration, which is called the wave of Tantra. There's a term called Tantra or Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle, the thunderbolt vehicle. I call it the apocalyptic vehicle, because it's a level of where the people don't want to just develop the society into some far-off future utopia, but they want to transform things here and now in a more apocalyptic manner. They want to see the diamond-like compassionate energy of the strong force of the atoms in there, suffusing their being and suffusing their neighborhoods and suffusing nature now. And so therefore it has a kind of very powerful depth psychology of really going into the unconscious and rooting out the instinctual traces of evil, hatred, lust, anger, ignorance, and doing it in a very immediate way. And the people who do it are very amazing, kind of Walt Whitman-esque type of characters. Actually, my kids in Amherst once in a class fooled me by bringing in, said that they had been looking in the library and they'd found this old book of Saraha, one of the great siddhas, who was one of these great adepts, these great tantrics of this second half of the first millennium of the Common Era in India. And they said, we found this, Professor Thurman, wonder what you think of it. And they started reading me Leaves of Grass. And I didn't recognize it. I hadn't been reading English literature been reading Tibetan books for 20 years. And hadn't had time to get back and enjoy the great classics like that. And I said, oh, that sounds good. And they were so happy. It went around for weeks. I thought, they found a new translation of an Indian Siddha, but they were just basically reading me Whitman, They were so happy with that one. As was I. Then I've spent more time on Whitman since then. Anyway, so this is then the third 500-year period, 500 approximately. These are very rough things in India that happened. And by the end of this time in India, and already long before that actually, India had become quite transformed as a society in many respects. But the most important respects of its transformation was that it had really lost its sort of martial vigor and martial power in a way. It was no longer such a feared, elephant cavalry type of country. And therefore it was easy prey to the Turkic and Iranian invasions and Islamic invasions of the end of the first millennium, which did completely change the whole landscape of India and in fact wiped out the Buddhist universities, monastic universities, totally. From around 800 of the Common Era to around 1200, 1300, they just exterminated from one end of India to the other this immense influence of this liberating institution that had become central actually in Indian society. And the Indian historians of the modern period so much are aware of that, in a way, subliminally, although they wouldn't, that thesis would not be acceptable to many of them at first, but yet you can see that they're aware of it because they blame Buddhism for India becoming conquered by the West, actually. And they blame monasticism and asceticism, and they say that if we'd stayed with our Vedic ways, our old Indian tribal ways, we would have never succumbed like that, you see. And in a way, it is true that this sort of pacification process that Buddhism attempts to instill in a population by making them enlightened and more peaceful and monasticized, it does make them more vulnerable. Just like the individual who becomes enlightened and no longer is, I'm absolute, and therefore get out of my face, they become more vulnerable, and in fact they can be put upon to some degree by people if they are careful. For example, in Buddhist texts that are teaching altruism and generosity, and they talk about great deeds of great heroic bodhisattvas in the past who fed themselves to wild animals or who gave their lives for this or that thing. They have these little caveats in the stories. They say, now don't rush out and do that. Don't rush out and feed the first tiger. It might be better to found the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Tigers. After all, tiger will munch you down and be hungry tomorrow, And you might use even though it's great that you have the nice, lovely idea to give yourself, it might be better to just cultivate that openness of mind without just throwing away your human life on the first tiger you meet, and then developing even wisdom and other kinds of higher faculties. And the fact that they have those caveats in the Buddhist books indicates that in that time in those societies, people really would act on these things. People would really develop these virtues. People would become what I call cool heroes and heroines, meaning they would develop the ability to offer themselves with the kind of heroism we associate only with military valor and in military heat of hatred, that is, and develop the courage to do that in a loving and cool and gentle way for some gentle purpose, not to destroy somebody, which I believe is a basic human ability that people in militaristic societies such as our own are systematically conditioned to believe it is impossible. They believe you can only train human being to be self-sacrificing out of hatred. And therefore, because the military is the only people who do train people to become self-sacrificing. And therefore, the military develop that sort of special power in people, in their military forces, and therefore they domineer the rest of us and frighten us and ramble us to death, movie after movie, and propaganda after propaganda about it. But anyway, in India, it seemed that the opposite was happening, so by the end, they became like that. Now, luckily, at the end of that time, starting around the 8th century, 7th century, 8th century of the Common Era, some wise persons in India began to look for a hideout when they started realizing what might be coming. And because apparently they were enlightened enough at least to have a certain prescience about the flow and tides and ebbs and flows of the tides of people. And foresaw perhaps that this sort of gentrified India, with its ragas and its vegetarianism and its mangoes and its like pleasant climate and its goddesses and so forth, that it might be a little vulnerable to a few camel drivers, you know, and sort of nasty, sort of like tough and rough types and insensitive types who might show up. So they looked up at one bunch of rough and tough insensitive types and they saw the Tibetans. And at that time, the Tibetans were like Genghis Khan's people. They had a huge empire in Central Asia. They conquered down into Bengal, into Nepal. They conquered China a couple of times during the Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty paid tribute to the Tibetans to keep them away, actually, far from being owners of Tibet. The Tibetans conquered China a couple of times. They conquered the whole Silk Route. They fought to its standstill Harun al-Rashid, the Caliph of Baghdad, in these centuries. So they were very tough people. But in a way, they also, luckily for their neighbors, unlike Genghis Khan, they came from this country, this amazing high plateau that is average of 15,000 feet. And apparently when you grow up at 15,000 feet with the sort of slightly mellow feelings that, you know, oxygen deprivation does to your brain, you apparently don't feel like settling down in low altitude Beijing or low altitude Calcutta or low altitude wherever it is. So even though you may raid and loot and pillage and conquer, you want to go back up to the cool highlands. And so they never wanted to settle. They reached maximum expansion around this time. And a king, an emperor of theirs, said, well, now we're at maximum expansion. This sort of war confederacy tribal trip that we're doing here, war gods and so on, and sacrifices and the wild tribal business is kind of boring. And also it's not a good ethic on which to have a peaceful internal existence, because people are always vying with each other, and I'll even have to worry about these generals coming back from battles and toppling me. So what would be a nice universal peaceful ethic? And he looked around the world and his neighboring kingdoms, and he saw the glory of the Pala dynasty and the post-Gupta dynasties in India. He saw the glory of the Tang dynasty, and he saw the glory of Central Asia, and all of that was Buddhism. Buddhist art, Buddhist temples, Buddhist monks, Buddhist literature, Buddhist everything. So he began to import it. And then the masters of the Buddhist institution began to send it up to Tibet. But here, unlike in the case of India, there wasn't three waves of sort of 500-year, breakers, rolling in. All three waves hit Tibet at once. Bam, monasticism, messianism of love and compassion, and apocalypticism of esoteric, diamond thunderbolt type of energy. And so the Tibetans was much quicker in a way their cycle, you could say. So from around 650 of the Common Era, when they began and built the first major temple by an emperor, against the will of the nobles, against the will of the warlords, against the will of the people, they thought this is some weird thing, this isn't our tribal deity, this isn't our war god, why is he building this thing? And these weird Buddhas, where are they coming from? He kind of had to force them. And for a couple hundred years, the dynasty kind of pushed this down, top down on the people, who were used to a much more violent, warlike way. After 1,000 years, by 1650, whatever people want to say about the imperfections of Tibet, Tibet did give up its militarism sort of more or less finally. And from 1650 to 1950, during the time of what I call modern Tibet, Tibet actually basically had no army. It was basically demilitarized. That doesn't mean, and that, people will say, oh, you're saying Tibet was so perfectly peaceful. Naive people will say that, falsely. I'm not saying that. There was plenty of wife beating. There was a bit of husband beating, I think, sometimes. There was a lot of, even rough monks. They had a couple of monks they called toughy monks, who used to have monk Olympics and wrestle, and they were like World Wrestling Federation. They were thug-like monks. I mean, there's lots of imperfections, but still the sociological fact remains that the government was composed by a certain type of coalition between monastics and the former nobles, and this was done by the monastics because they had the power, and they actually expropriated the private armies from the nobles, who had been making like a couple of centuries of war before that in the 15th and 16th centuries. And early part of the 17th century, and they basically took away all the armies from the nobles, they took away the feudal powers from those nobles, and they created a monastic government where the head of the government was a monk, which was something unique in Buddhist history and only happened there. And if you see it in terms of my thesis and dialectic of the competition throughout the history of Asian societies and also Western and Christian societies particularly, which is the other great monastic religion, monastic and military were always vying for resources and power and prestige in societies. And when the military would co-opt the monastic, then the country would head for war. And when the monastic would create an asylum against the military, there might be periods of peace. And you can sort of see that if you look through history. And you don't be fooled by, precisely when sometimes monks go to war, when the monastic power, the shogun or the warlords, co-opt the monastics, and then they start making war, then that's the loss of the true essence of the monastic, if you follow me. And so Tibet is the only case in the 17th century where this struggle between the warlords and the monastics was decided in favor of the monastics. And since that time until 1950, 85% of the national treasure, at least, the overt one, the amount that actually came through the government from taxes and then sent back out in distributions, went to support monastic education, monastic universities. They had a country it became a type of society that I call a mass monastic society, not the dualistic medieval type of monastic society where there's a little bit of monasticism and mainly a bunch of knights clanking around in armor, but one where there's like so many monks it's ridiculous, and nuns, that it's really ridiculous. And there's really no more knights, basically. And during that whole time, any time there was a little bit of incursion into Tibet or a little problem, the Tibetans had to invite in some warlord from outside, the Manchu emperor or some Mongol Khan, to come and get rid of this other problem because they just didn't have the military resources to deal with it. And that is an undeniable sociological fact, and that isn't romanticizing Tibet, that is reporting a fact. And a great achievement of a society that 1,000 years before that had been a Genghis Khan-like, a Pentagon America-like society. In 1,000 years, they switched and demilitarized, basically. And therefore, in the same as India, and even more poignantly as we are seeing today, became vulnerable. And for some years, the lamas, by the prestige and by the fact that the powerful neighbors were Buddhist, Mongol kings and Manchu emperors, they were able to be protected from outside whenever any other person would come against them. But then this broke down in the modern period where there were the communists, materialists in China, and then the British. And they couldn't protect them, because they didn't believe in they didn't honor those lamas, they didn't care about Buddhism, so then they did destroy the place. And the other thing that in between there that also is an amazing event that they did is that the Tibetans exported this particular type of mass monastic lifestyle. They exported it to the Mongols, that had been Genghis Khan in the second millennium, right? Genghis Khan's empires in the 13th and 14th centuries, 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, biggest empire in human history, without any machinery except bows and arrows and horses. Much bigger, though, than the British Empire or any other empire, or the Russian Empire. And they made the Mongols vulnerable and peaceful, too, although also funky. Not perfect, not Shangri-La, but peaceful, nevertheless. The basic, Mongol, I used to work carpentry in New Jersey with different Mongolians. And these are these guys who, when they come to the American diet, they're like 6 feet tall and 6 feet wide and 6 feet thick. And I would nail and hammer them, and their hand would go whistling by my head with a 22-ounce hammer, hitting in a 22-penny nail in one stroke. As in some rafter framing things, I'd be nailing, tap, 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 tap. And I'd be thinking, thank you, Buddha. Genghis Khan is like hitting nails with building a Buddhist temple with me. Thanks, Buddha. Thanks, Tibetan lamas. So that's kind of the history, okay? Now we turn to the spiritual path itself and the sort of vision of life that these people are doing. Is they're sort of the main sort of backbone thing. Not that everyone in Tibet, of course, does that, but many aspects, as you'll see when I go through it, are very part and parcel of many of the strange phenomena of Tibetan civilization that people are so amazed by and so puzzled by, and result in this incredible devoutness that people observe in the Tibetans. Even though they may be ignorant, even a bandit, even a guy will come and rob you, and maybe he'll kill you, but we won't use that example because then you couldn't observe him afterwards. But rob you, and then he'll go to the temple and start praying and like bowing and like worrying about it. But he just robbed you too. So he's not quite, realized it, but he's still devout, He's worried about that sin he just committed and is going to commit tomorrow. So in between he tries to accumulate a little virtue, say, okay, so now the path, now the path to enlightenment is sort of an ancient thing in Buddhism, but the Tibetans kind of streamlined it into what they called the Jiangtu Lam Rim, what's called Lam Rim, the stages of the path of enlightenment teaching. And it's really very simple. It has three main divisions. And these three main divisions, the first one is called renunciation, or I like to say transcendent renunciation. The second is called the spirit of enlightenment, of love and compassion for all beings, and that really is spirituality in a way for the Buddhists. And the third is love and compassion and the third is the wisdom of selflessness of persons and things, it's called, or the wisdom of the relationality of ultimate reality, of universal reality, something like that. Basically wisdom, knowledge of the nature of reality. So those are the three main divisions of the path. And the path begins by, first thing that the path begins with, the first theme in the path, other than a kind of appreciation of the teaching and the teacher, which of course is a kind of first theme, but the real first theme that you really dwell upon and you really meditate will, I think, surprise you all. It is how great this human life is. What a marvelous thing is a human, is where it begins. Because the reason that we waste our lives, and you waste your time making widgets or making money, which is equally useless, past a certain point. I mean, you got to eat, and you got to feed and pay tuition, etc. But then there's billions and zillions and things that people waste their time with. That's total waste. They couldn't even eat it all if they tried to eat the actual money itself, or if they tried to, someone like Ted Turner or Soros. I mean, they couldn't even probably burn it all if they had a constant bonfire going with $100 bills between now and doomsday. But then now when they keel over with a heart attack or the pacemaker fails, And so, but the reason why we do that is that we don't respect ourselves. The reason why we allow ourselves to be enslaved by this or that prejudice or hatred or ideology or staring mindlessly at some tube or something is that we don't respect our own time. Because we feel, well, what are we going to really do with life? I mean, we're just like us, we go to do some work, then we eat, as long as everything's okay. We defend ourselves, then we're going to die. And what else is there to do type of thing, Now, this luckily is a Catholic institution, but that is the kind of post-Protestant secularist idea that life is meaningless that we really live with. But from the Tibetan point of view, our basic, real, crippling ideological problem is that we do not think we will have a future life. Not one of you, well, no, because you might, because some of you are religious, some of you are Catholics and are religious, and you might make a donation to the church. You might think that you should prepare for the angels or St. Peter. We were making St. Peter's jokes at dinner. You might want to get prepared to get through those pearly gates, have the right credit card or security clearance, handprint, and but relatively very few. And even if we have a belief that there is such a thing as an afterlife because of our religious affiliation, we don't really live for that. We don't put the same oomph of that we put into our pension, our retirement plan, or a Florida getaway. That's where we know we're going to have that, or we think we might die before we get to enjoy that, of course, if we overwork. But we think we're going to have that, so we really live, we plan for this life. We only plan for this life. We are brought up in a culture that thinks that life is meaningless and random, even that life is an illusion. Because it's just the wetware flopping around, The wetware flops, and a little electric signal goes, and you didn't take the right Prozac, so suddenly you think that you're there. But really you're not, as any microbiologist, neuropsychologist, cognitive scientist at MIT will tell you. You're not really there, you're just kind of like a berserk computer that doesn't know how to run right. And the fact that you're there is just an accident. It's just some atoms went bloop and a selfish gene went blop and that's it, and you're here. And no matter how great you are and if you become enlightened, you're going to die and you're going to be nothing. Even if you're so good, you give yourself to all beings, you're going to die and you're going to be nothing. And the selfish slob who goes and robs everybody is also going to die and going to be nothing. So what's the point of anything? And this is how our people grow up. So therefore, if even if you blew up the whole planet, that everyone would quickly be nothing, and then never mind, So let's put some more nuclear power plants on top of the San Andreas Fault, and let's forget the ozone layer. Who cares? We're all going to be nothing, so it all doesn't matter. Isn't this our sickness? This, from the Buddhist point of view, is spiritually crippling. And the Tibetan path begins with overcoming this delusion, which is clearly, I want to tell you a story. I know someone is a medical doctor, a very, very important neuro whatever, in New York. But I'm not going to mention the name, but this guy is really has a lot of hardware, so you know he's important. A lot of funds, billions, millions go through that office. And we were talking about maybe some sort of dialogue, and maybe he was hoping to stick some things into some Tibetan yogis. That was his real ultimate goal. But anyway, he was talking with me. And in the process, at one point I mentioned something about, well, it'd be interesting to think of what a difference it makes in the lives of these people that they think they might have a future life. They have a sense of being connected to the causality of their actions and the consequences of their actions beyond even the death in this life. It might be interesting to think of that. And I wasn't saying that, that it might be so. I wasn't at all saying that. I knew the guy. I was just saying, we have to think of what the people have in their minds when we go and measure, see if that makes a difference. And he just jumped up all nervously, don't even say it in this building. That's primitive, old-fashioned. Don't say such a thing. He said, he was looking around in case a colleague overheard. He was talking with such a person, And he said, there's nothing happens after death. We know that. We've discovered it. We've proved it. We've found it. It is established beyond a doubt. He said, and I said, oh, okay. I said, I'm an American too, I teach at Columbia. Relax. I was just talking about some Tibetan. I backed away, because he was so upset, And then I went, and then 2 days later, I almost got arrested by my taxi driver, going somewhere to a meeting, because I just began to laugh uncontrollably. Because I suddenly realized from this dialogue 2 days earlier, this guy was going around in his life thinking that you can find nothing, you can prove nothing, you can verify nothing. You can get a report about nothing. And that is an incontrovertible fact. Nothing is a controvertible fact. Do you realize what an act of imagination that is? A failure of knowing of what the words that the man was saying mean? Nothing is nothing. It's the one thing nobody could ever find, could ever prove, could ever discover, could ever enter. It is simply nothing. It is not a place. It is not a dark hole. It is not a deep sleep. Therefore, it's the one thing in the universe that no one has ever found. And no one could ever prove existed. And in fact, the imagination that it could exist is completely a bit of mental projection. Obviously, because it's nothing. It's the word for what is not there. So who's going to enter it and go to sleep in it, for crying out loud? Do you get the point? The person who commits suicide because they're embarrassed over losing their stock market fortune is thinking they're going to go deeper than a deep sleep and never wake up to face this bankruptcy. They are having, therefore, in the mind is imprisoned by a picture of a dark space of total anesthesia, a permanent escape, a kind of instant nirvana by just messing with the wetware, with a quick whatever. Right? So they're going right into that imagination of nothing, they think, and of course they're going to get nowhere. And they're going to find themselves in a worse than bankrupt state in the other life. St. Peter's going to ask for a little toll payment. They're going to have nothing. Not going to have a brain left. They're just walking around with a hole in their head. And probably a big headache in the between state, as we say it, as we call it in Tibet. So anyway, I'm trying to teach the first theme of the Buddhist path. So the first theme of the Buddhist path is to cure this childish absolutization of nothingness, thinking that we can be disconnected from anything. Buddha was celebrated once by what famous verse that he was the discoverer of causation, and that every cause has an effect, and everything comes from a cause, and also, therefore, how to intervene in a causal thing if it's unpleasant to make it pleasant. And this was his great achievement, was discovering causation in that civilization. Sound familiar? Like the Greek business, doesn't it? But his causation that was important to him was mental causation, of course, spiritual causation, what caused negative spiritual and mental and emotional states. And the causation that caused good in mental and emotional and spiritual states, that was what he thought was the more important causation, which is not the same as the Greek thing. The Greeks went into the outer thing, as we are stuck in the outer thing. But this is the key thing to be cured of at the first den in the Tibetan path, in the beginning of the path, is to accept, to develop the maturity, even though we still have subliminal and subconscious absolutist and escapist tendencies in our hearts and wish to sort of hide and withdraw from reality and from life and from interconnectedness, but to acknowledge the reality of interconnectedness to the sufficient degree that we feel we are embedded in an evolutionary process that is beginningless as far as we know. And I don't think that's a big contradiction from Christianity or from theistic things that say everything began with God, because God is beginningless. So when it began with God, it's just like saying began from beginninglessness, which is just what the Buddhists say. They just don't personalize it. They say it's beginningless. That's how they solve the chicken and the egg. Did God first make an egg or a chicken? God knew all about chickens and eggs beginninglessly, infinitely into the past, and therefore that you have to be prepared to be a part of an evolution infinitely into the future. Once this becomes accepted in a certain way, once you feel plugged in like that, then you have a certain type of motivation, you have a meaning in life. And what is the meaning? Not to let this infinite consequentiality of all your thoughts, words, and deeds go in a negative direction. Even selfishly, you have that motive then. Just like we don't want to ruin our lives and have no pension and have no insurance and have no this and have no that and wreck our lungs and die horribly and pennilessly and abandoned. So we therefore take precautions to see to it that we have a decent future. So you want to have a decent future all the way. This is the beginning of spiritual practice in the Buddhist Tibetan path. And this is why Tibetans will recite mantras day and night when they retire. They will bow to images. They will do every kind of virtuous thing to build up positive karmic or evolutionary accumulation of merit and wisdom. And then, of course, within that framework, by the way, and this is now coming back to the first theme, the human embodiment that we now have is something magnificent, and it is not something that just popped out of a seed by accident. Each one of us who is a human being has developed and evolved from lesser life forms to become human with our own effort. We have been interacting with others. We have been beholden to them. Their gods also have been involved. But we ourselves also have made choices. When we were a crocodile, we let one mommy zebra go one day. We didn't eat every zebra that jumped into that. We didn't eat ones that we didn't need. We were the more altruistic crocodile. And then we were reborn as one that had like a swiveling eye, or had a smaller jaw so we could begin to talk. How can you talk with such teeth, Really. I don't know what kind of noises they make, actually. But in order to develop the kind of human mouth that can talk, you have to do a lot less chewing. And who would talk to you when you were coming at them with a mouth like that anyway? They'd be smart to run away. So the point is, each one of us has individually evolved from different life forms, and the form that we have now, therefore, in a way, is our own earning. And the particular form that we have where there intrudes upon our awareness something different than just grab what's in front of you, survive, just jump on the next thing, gulp the next air, grab the next food, and it is, what am I? Who am I? What is this thing? What could I do? What is the meaning of this? We are this amazing being that can think about itself. We have had the notion of liberty enter into our idea. We have encountered, directly or indirectly through history, Buddhas, beings, bodhisattvas, saints, beings who have transcended the ordinary instinctual selfish drive. And we realize that there is a higher way of being than just selfishly leaping on whatever's in front of us. This is called having the special, precious jewel of a human embodiment endowed with liberty and opportunity, and it's very carefully specified. And the first thing, therefore, you have to do, therefore, if you have such a thing, imagine your brain, your heart, your soul is like a Stradivarius. It's like a fantastic piano, some incredible artistic thing with which you can make the most amazing creations. And you can even find out what you are, for sure, and liberate yourself from being driven by your unconscious or your instincts. And yet you're going to spend that driving on a highway? The neuroscientists say we use 7% of our brain in life. In fact, they don't even know what the brain is for, the rest of it. And they actually say that women's brains are more redundant than men's, surprisingly. And in other words, more useless, that means, than men's. And they don't know why we have this amazing this amazing bunch of like hard disk, soft, wet disk, or whatever it is. But the Buddhists would say, clearly we evolved this to discover the nature of the world, to find happiness, to find out our purpose of life, of happiness that we can achieve and really achieve it. So the first meditation on the spiritual path in Buddhism is meditation on the glory of being the kind of a human that has the opportunity of achieving true spiritual freedom, overcoming selfishness definitively and ultimately, including with its instinctual residues, and having a boundless life of loving, wise benefit to the universe. That's the purpose of life. And we have that opportunity to do it, and therefore we shouldn't waste this magnificent thing of ours, which is a human life. And also, based on that too, we should never take another person's human life over some nonsense, squabble, or send them to somewhere to lose their life. Human life, and actually all life, but especially human life, should be cherished above all. So that's the first theme. Then the second theme is, of course, the immediacy of death. Once you're really proud of yourself, and once you really appreciate yourself, and you realize how amazing you can come to understand something, then you are supposed to recognize how quickly you might lose this amazing thing that you have. And just as when you fall asleep at night, you don't really know what kind of a dream you'll have, because you're even told by the so-called scientists of the mind that there's all this stuff in there that you never will know what is there. It just bubbles up. You know, from Vienna, I think it comes. And it bubbles up. And that it's unconscious, and it's got to be, in principle, always unconscious. No idea that actually enlightenment means becoming conscious of the unconscious. It is unconscious to normal people, but it can become made conscious. And we can become conscious in our dreams. We can learn to dream consciously. They've known that for thousands of years. And so just as, however, we're normally unconscious about it, we can't tell. Then when we died, we couldn't tell how we would go because we don't know what our real impulses are. We don't know what could take us over, what passion, what hatred, what terror, what fear, and which would take us into negative states. So therefore, the immediacy of death is the second theme. And that's, of course, a theme universal in religions. And we know Americans, everyone looks worried. But actually, it's a very liberating thing. Atisha, the great Indian master who visited Tibet in the 11th century, was asked once, it's my favorite bit of marriage counseling, actually. It's the only Buddhist marriage counseling I know, actually, from the tradition, because they're so monastic. But anyway, he was asked, how do we help a husband and wife who are not getting along? And he said, let husband and wife reflect that each of them will soon be dead. And then they should be nice to each other in the meantime. That's very, very liberating, I think. And if we combine the notion of the glory of the embodiment that we have with its skills and its introspective ability, with the fact that it is like a candle flame in the wind, it can be blown out by so many, any one of us can be run over any time, anything can happen to us at any time, internal or external, then we appreciate it develops, if you meditate on that, you develop tremendous intensity. Again, not to waste your time. As they say, the first line in the path, and the most concise formulation of the path, is that liberty and opportunity of the human embodiment is hard to find, and there is no time in life. There is simply no time. Be at your total intensity of awareness at all times. Be mindful of every moment. Don't waste and wait, I'll do it later, tomorrow, after next year, when I retire, when I go on sabbatical. Be there now, because you might not be there then. And then when you get that way, then suddenly the moment opens up and you find the infinity of the moment. And you find that there's no nothing, and you'll find the future, everything in the moment. Anyway, so that's that theme. That's the second theme. The third theme then is called the theme of the suffering third theme is the theme of universal interaction and causation. And reflecting on how everything is interconnected with everything else and how everything is caused by everything else, and seeing the vast causal processes of the universe. It's sort of like a spiritualized Darwinian type of meditation of all life forms, all interactive and as much science as you know, but then adding the science of the mind with it and not just crushing the mind out of it as materialist metaphysics would have us do, and seeing the total interconnectedness of everything and realizing how the slightest negative thought produces a negative result, the positive thought produces a positive thought, word that is a little more gentle and a little less harsh, a little more clear, a little less confusing and meaningless, has a great impact. And then becoming alert and aware of everything that you do and think and say. That's the next theme. It's called the cause and effect of evolutionary action, mental, verbal, and physical. And then the fourth theme is the universality of suffering of the unenlightened life. That is, given my falsely absolutized self-centeredness, nothing will really be satisfactory under such a condition. I'll never really be content with anything, really finally facing that. Even in heaven, can you see, you go to St. Peter, there's so many jokes, and St. Peter shows you the mansion is like, and then your neighbor comes and gets a better one next door. I mean, come on. You will not be content. Once you're self-centered and you're going to be envious of other people or competitive with them, then you'll never be satisfied, no matter what. And so the next theme is meditating on the unsatisfactory, just more or less what Socrates said. The unenlightened life will always be unsatisfactory, so that you don't waste your effort trying to get the ultimate home, find the ultimate town, find the ultimate relationship, find the ultimate job, the ultimate this, the ultimate bank account, because there is no ultimate any such thing as long as you are a self-centered person who depends only on external things for a little relief now and then, and have no real well of joy within yourself. Because you're so measuring everything you have within yourself, you're totally discontented with it all the time. So those four themes, if you put them together, the preciousness and the endowment of human life, of liberty and opportunity, the immediacy of death, the total intercausality of everything, and the universal suffering automatically inherent in the self-centered, unenlightened lifestyle, once you have that, then you achieve transcendent renunciation, what it's called. And you no longer have any desire you give up, you transcend desire for any sort of paltry pleasures, minor temporary reliefs, and you decide to put your energy into the sort of transcendent purpose of life to become truly happy and to make all beings truly happy. So that's the first set of the paths under that, and that's the first division of the four themes of this Tibetan spiritual path. The next set of themes, and I will accelerate. I should more than accelerate, but I won't quit. I'm going to accelerate. The next set of themes is the themes of the love and compassion of the spirit of enlightenment, it's called. And this involves having achieved that. Apparently, when you achieve that transcendence, far from what we might think, you might be sort of gloomy, having just reflected that the unenlightened life is always frustrating. But in fact, you feel terrific relief, because you're no longer driven by all these vain ambitions for things for goals that are not really satisfactory. You have honored yourself with a much higher goal for your existence. And you're actually much happier and you feel relief. And the minute you do, you see other beings and you realize how preoccupied they are with the next meal and the next thing and the next fame and the next thing someone's going to say to them, and how they're totally worrying over nothing and having a miserable time. So then you contemplate on that and you begin to feel, you do the meditation which is called recognizing the motherhood of all beings, where you reflect that because you and every other being in the universe have been reborn together endlessly, beginninglessly rather. We have all been in every conceivable relationship with each other. We've given each other a very hard time, infinite numbers of times. We have also been, but more important than that, we have been each other's mothers. I have been every single one of your mother. And it was like a big job, let me tell you. And I know I was a lot of trouble when you were my mother, every single one of you, including the men. You were my mother. And, because we've all been born in every gender, we've been born in every animal species, every race, every whatever, and all with each other. So we're here today in each other's face. We've been in each other's face infinite numbers of times already. And the key one to dwell upon, though, is that we have been each other's mothers. And particularly myself, imagine how we feel. And sometimes people have a hard time with this in America because don't get along with their mother or something once they grew up and got a personality and read Freud. But actually at that sort of biological level, the mammal mother is amazing, because being self-centered like other ignorance-driven beings, they nevertheless open the envelope of their body and take another being into it, and share the bloodstream, and share the life, and also wake up at 2 in the morning for many years and give milk. And I mean, the basic mammal form is amazing like that, in that the boundary of self and other is almost naturally, and that didn't just happen because it popped out of an egg from a mad scientist. The beings that became mammals earned their way to that by being altruistic and gentle and imagining the nature of other and realizing the fluidity of self-identity. and being born in a way where they didn't have quite such a hard shell and such a weird exoskeleton and all the things that the other non-mammalian life forms tend to have. So the meditation on the mother, anyway, I have to be quick because it's late. The meditation on the mother is where you, by meditating on that, using the solvent of our sort of reifying the immediate relationship that we have with those we either don't like, do like, or don't know, and you see the motherhood in all beings, you develop a meditative thing where you feel connected, like to all living creatures, in a kind of stream of blood and milk, where you're all flowing together as one sort of lively thing. It's like a meditation of familiality. Not just familiarity, but familiality where you feel kin to all beings. And you will feel overwhelming affection for beings when you do this meditation pretty quickly, and you will even get where they look familiar to you as if they were your mother. Even an enemy will look like your mother and so on. And when you do that, then you go through a process of steps of mother recognition, remembrance of kindness, gratitude, love, compassion, and then the special sixth mind, which is called the messianic resolution or the universal responsibility. Because you say, my mothers who bore me so many lives, they are suffering from ignorance infinitely, and they can go on infinitely like that in the future. There's no automatic fate that causes them to wake up. Unfortunately, even Buddha woke up. He didn't wake us up because you can't do it to somebody else. Each person can only understand their own freedom. You can't force another person to be free. And so therefore, what can I do for these, my mothers? I must make them happy. The other Buddhas in the past didn't do it. There's millions of them. I must do it. And this sort of messianic resolution comes out of that meditation where you vow that all of your lives in the future you will do everything you can to become a totally enlightened being in order to liberate all other beings from suffering by teaching them how to realize their own true nature. A definite messianic attitude, which I recognize within the context of our culture, which we only have the one life, is a kind of insanity. Because how could you save all beings? Because if you're only going to die, and then you and they are going to be nothing, you don't have to worry about saving them. We might just obliterate them all, then they'll all have to be nothing and they'll be happy. In our culture. But in a culture where we're going to be reborn infinitely in the future also, and here we will sit, and we're going to be harmful to each other or helpful, but we'll all be puzzled, scratching our heads. What do we do here? What's the purpose? And we won't really be happy. We won't really be satisfied. Do we really want to go on with that in the future? Because we're not going to get away from each other. Once we're never going to get away from each other, then it is rational to optimize our interrelationship. Right? Really make each other happy. Really love each other. We would do it. If we were locked up somewhere by a mad scientist and not allowed even to die, even we never knew each other before, we would take an intense interest in each other. I call it the New York subway realization. We live our lives like we're all on a subway together and we're going to get off it real quick, and we don't want to look too closely at anybody else on the subway with us. We just read out a little paper there, and don't look at them. It's dangerous to look at them. And if they look at you, you wonder if they want to mug you or something. Although it's much better nowadays. But then the mad scientist shunts the car to the side, locks the doors. You're locked on the subway car with those passengers, including the weird beggar who says he has AIDS or whatever it is. Then suddenly, and after you pound the door and say, do you know how I am, and flaunt your credit cards and stuff, you realize the mad scientist is serious, and he's going to see what happens to beings who locked up together like this for an interminable period of time. And you're then going to be really caring about every single person in that subway. So the Buddhist vision of evolution and of life, of biology, is that we are locked up together with each other forever. And we keep coming back at each other in different ways. And if we're nasty to each other in one life, then the next one will be nasty back in the next life. And this will go on forever, like a sort of infinite recurrence, like Nietzsche's thing, So therefore, we want it to be right. We want to do the absolute maximal best for everyone. It becomes rational to take up that messianic drive to save all beings from suffering, to make them all happy and love all beings. So there's a whole bunch of other meditations there. It's very elaborate meditations on compassion that have disappeared from Western culture really since the days of Augustine, the days of Francis of Assisi, or St. Boniface or something. They were there in those monastic traditions, but they've been lost in the Protestant culture that thinks you can't do anything about your mind but make money. I mean, believe on this hand and make money on that hand. Then the third major theme, and I will end, don't worry. The third major theme is the wisdom theme. So the first one has given you a sense of detachment and freedom and transcendence. The second one has locked you in a loving, total messianic, total altruistic orientation towards beings, which we might think would be exhausting, but according to their psychology is the secret of total happiness on the part of people who adopt it. Even as impossible as it seems, just that you are oriented towards the positive outcome of evolution, a voluntary teleology, not a teleology because some automatic fate is running a machine called the world in a certain way, but a teleology that you vow to create yourself. I choose the purpose of life of happiness for all beings in addition to myself. And you then, everything becomes motivated by that teleology, and then many more things become bearable, and then the tremendous energy is released by that, strangely enough. Even though you'd think it would drive you nuts, it becomes really, it's the key of the colorfulness and of the dynamism, the energy of Buddhist societies. Finally, then we come to the wisdom one. Those two, transcendence and love and compassion and messianic spirit, by themselves will not liberate anybody. They will improve the outlook immensely and improve the deeds and improve the feelings of people, but will not liberate them. The only thing that liberates them is understanding the nature of the self and of the world. And that's the third thing, section, which is wisdom. And wisdom proceeds, and I wish I had more time, but wisdom proceeds basically in a process of the most sophisticated analysis of identity, the identity crisis, identity formation, identity deconstruction, and identity reconstruction that any human culture has ever developed. And, I'm saying that not as a Buddhist fanatic, I'm saying that as a student of comparative psychologies in the world. It is truly amazing, the insight into how the identity works, how it grips us, and how it can be reformed to liberate us and to become a vehicle that is positive for us, knowledge of identity, based, of course, fundamentally on the insight into the relativity of identity, which is discovered, of course, not by just adopting the slogan that it is relative, but is discovered by acknowledging that in ourselves we have an instinctual habit of absolutizing our identity and clinging to a rigid identity, and that first acknowledging how powerfully we're wired like that, and then second, going on a deep quest of what that identity is, trying to find that thing that we feel is there, and then sustaining in a very sophisticated way the failure to find it, which will inevitably occur, and not finding some sort of a nothingness and going into a blanked out state, which is a danger if we're unprepared, and not finding some sort of like Tinkerbell sort of thing, and like going off on a fantasy, but they're drilling through and overcoming the irrational, fundamental, distorted, misknowing structure in the core of our being that causes all of our trouble, that puts us into the impossible task of trying to be an absolute being in a relative world, which we can never succeed in doing. But just by saying, oh, well, then I'm not absolute, will not work, because we will unconsciously absolutize nothingness then. What we must do is try to discover that absolute being that we admit that we feel, and when we fail to do that, sustain that failure where we don't find the failure either, and don't absolutize the failure, and then eventually in like a slow dissolving process, not the false idea people have about enlightenment that it's some pop type of eureka thing, but rather, no, it's a slow dissolving type of melting type of gradual maturing process where the rigidity of the self-absolutizing habit erodes and we begin to feel related and relational. There's like a feeling in the heart of kind of like a flutter of relief, some sort of it's like, as I like to say, it's like it has been described, because I can't really verify it, but it has been described as if you discover suddenly that there had been some sort of a pincer in the middle of your heart, squeezing on your heart, which you thought was like a natural part of your anatomy. And you therefore were going around with this slight pain in it, no matter what else you had that was pleasure to it. There was like this pain, this stabbing pain in your heart. But when you realize there's no absolute rigid identity in there, this thing somehow releases and relaxes, and such a welling of relief and joy comes out of your heart that, minor little itches and pains and scratches and things feel like nothing, and you really feel like jumping and kicking up your heels together. because this thing that you didn't even know was a pain that was crunching you in the very center of your being has released itself through your own effort of seeing through that delusory instinctual habit. Okay, is that, you got enough on wisdom? And then that, of course, reinforces the appreciation of yourself. The more relief you get, the more reinforced you are that you shouldn't be doing some like really stupid waste of life thing. And the more happy you become, the more helpful to others, the more loving you become to others. And eventually, if you keep it up, you'll become a Buddha. You will really, really manifest Buddhahood, they say. And so that is anyway, that is the Tibetan path. Then there's some other levels of it, sort of magical level, visualization level. Marvelous thing Tibetans did that is amazing is they developed kind of their version of an astronaut, was what I call a psychonaut. And these psychonauts were like people who would go into certain types of yogas where they would rehearse the death process. And they would go into sort of dissolving. They would, like, for example, even when you sleep, when you sleep, you kind of rehearse the death process ourselves. We naturally do. We lose consciousness of our sense consciousness when we fall asleep. And then we go into a state of unawareness. And then we might arise in a dream state. Without knowing that we're dreaming, we think we're doing something, going somewhere, and then when we wake up, we realize we had dreamt. And often we forget that we dreamt, because this all happens to us without being aware of it. But these yogins, these psychonauts, they develop the conscious lucid dreaming. They're aware of themselves falling asleep. In a weird way, they're aware of themselves being unaware, and then they become aware of rising into dream and then coming back. And by that kind of practice, and then an even more advanced kind of practice where they go into like stopping the breath and going into certain sort of out-of-body things and in kind of trance-type experimental things, just like an astronaut, jumping into outer space. They jump into sort of these gravity chamber things, and then they develop a knowledge of how to connect and disconnect the subtle mind and body from the coarse, the physical mind and body and so forth. And the whole Book of the Dead lore and all of that emerges from that. And it's immensely fascinating, but we are immensely out of time. But they, and they did that not because they're some weird Tibetans or because they're all happy or because they're all spiritual. Not at all. They're just an ordinary bunch of like Genghis Khan Rambos 1,300 years ago. And then poor guys, they got like jumped on by all these great scholars and yogis and adepts and psychonauts who ran away from the Muslims in India to get up there. And then they worked them over, And then they put all that same kind of energy we put into making cars and making refrigerators and running around highways and wasting all the money, like pouring oil up and down the earth to make a highway so we could drive 80 miles an hour nervously to get somewhere where we'll have no time when we get there because we have to drive 80 miles an hour back. Instead of putting all that cleverness into all that zipping around, they put that cleverness into zipping in their mind. And zipping around while they're sleeping and dreaming and doing this and that. And of course, not just like everybody is not an electrical engineer or a computer scientist. Not everybody was doing that. But enough were doing it that they really made it priority. It was the priority. They were the most respected. They were like John Glenn, like Neil Armstrong, were these inner lamas. And the Dalai Lama came out of that. The idea that these people really achieved this ability and they could die and be reborn where they wanted. And if a certain county had had bad sheriffs for a couple of generations, why such a bodhisattva would die and he would find a nice womb in that place and he would perform a successful womb shot and land there. And of course every Tibetan mom was waiting for a bodhisattva or a psychonaut because the minute the psychonaut would pop up, rainbows would pour out of her navel. And then the local lamas would show up and go, wow, she's got rainbows coming out of her navel. And they'd make her first mom of the county and the son would become the lama sheriff. And therefore, we wouldn't have any baloney about some crooked politician. The politicians would be out there saying, I've been 7 lives on the job. Elect me. And the other one would know, I've been 14 lives on the job. Elect me. I mean, it's a very bizarre society because it has these other reality parameters, that's all. It isn't that they're so magical or special or woozle-wuzzles. They just have different reality parameters, and they put that same human ingenuity into those reality parameters. And they are those really diametrically opposite to ours in great degree, and therefore they developed a civilization that is truly a human treasure. And especially what should interest us, since what our great danger in history is now and in life at this time at the end of the 20th century, what should especially interest in this is not that we should become Buddhists or Tibetan Buddhists. That would be hopeless. Half of the Tibetans are not Tibetan Buddhists practically. They just sort of subliminally do it and they don't really do it. But this tradition and its sciences are something that we can use ourselves, and we have responsibility maybe to do it because we have such a huge external power over the fate of the other people on the planet. We deplete the ozone layer. If we turn their lifestyle into our style, like the massive billions of people in China and India, if we were to give them our neurotic, nervous, over-technologized, materialistic lifestyle, unvarnished, we would all choke to death. So we have a responsibility to rebalance our whole militaristic, externalistic system with some inner technology. Some of us, yes, can just go and have faith and run over and be born again somewhere, fine, but others want to do something, use this intelligence. We can't just throw away the intelligence and just say, well, let someone else take care of it, God or somebody. We have to take responsibility ourselves to take care of it. And we can't take care of it unless we take responsibility for ourselves and take control of ourselves. And like, for example, no one could get to be president and have the nuclear football if they didn't have proof of control of their emotions. That should be an election requirement. Some sort of basket case who loses their temper or gets all slobbery over this and that, and it's like a total victim of greed and lust and delusion and confusion, they should not be allowed anywhere near these like things that could destroy all human life. If we were sane, we wouldn't allow it. So this is why there is something so immensely interesting and valuable in that. And that is not a fantasy, and that is not like, the people who think it's a fantasy, and we better not say anything good about Tibet. Oh, that's terrible, because then people won't realize that there are real Tibetans there or something. Absurd idea, and part of that whole jealous thing that somehow we Americans are the greatest. We must be the greatest, because we have the biggest cars. And if we're not the greatest, nobody's the greatest, and there never was anything greater than us. That's a ridiculous, childish pride thing that we really should get over when we are the people who are threatening our own lives and the lives of the planet. We are clearly not the greatest. We're like Genghis Khan was years before. We're the heirs of that. We are living on top of a genocide on this continent. We have not made up for the slavery at all. I'm in a school I teach. Right next to me is Harlem. So this is silly that we keep going like, we're the greatest. We can't fix our health scene because we pretend we have the greatest health scene, and we don't. Sorry. The point is this is the topic was the Tibetan spiritual path. And the Tibetan spiritual path is therefore something that we can extrapolate and we can reinforce whatever our own personal spiritual path. Really, there is no Tibetan spiritual path. There's like 6 million Tibetans. There may be like 50 million of them through history. Each one was a Tibetan spiritual path, and some didn't even get into it. And therefore, when different of us use such a thing as really think about what a marvelous being we are, really think about how we could love all beings and be happy for it, whether they returned our love or not, really could understand our own nature, just for the hell of it, just for to know what we are, then each one of us will be a spiritual path. We can connect that with the culture of Christianity, with the culture of Islam, with the culture of secularism, of humanism. Doesn't matter. It will be our uniquely tailored path of getting out of being brainwashed into grimy misery and like irresponsible apathy and becoming active and really taking responsibility, having a good time, changing our world, and voting for positive-minded people, and also not voting so that some morons take over this country. So please, we should all vote, whoever you're going to vote for. Okay? And so that's it. Now, I guess I should answer some questions. I know I've worn you out. That's it. I can't take anymore. Questions. So, please ask a couple of questions. Somebody has some question, I'm sure. Please, ask some question. It's very disgraceful in the Tibetan tradition, the Buddhist tradition, not to have questions. Just to say a bunch of things and then run away without answering any questions.
I do have a question.
Yes, you have a question. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I read that you bring Tibetan thought and Eastern philosophy into all the universities of the United States.
That's true.
I'd like to hear about that.
Well, I don't think that. Put it this way: when you read Plato, no one thinks that you're converting to the worship of the Delphic oracle. It's just human philosophy, right? And so you should be able to read Nagarjuna, who can definitely go toe-to-toe with Plato. And there's like 500 Platos and another 1,000 Aristotles in India, where they had hundreds of libraries of Alexandria. It was a much richer, bigger place, and the tyrants were more lazy, they were more indulged, they were fatter, they had bigger harems. They didn't bother to give hemlock milkshakes to all the academics. And so there were a lot more academics writing in those days and thinking of things, and yogis, and therefore they developed yoga. This marvelous way of using the body even to focus the mind more sharply, which is really all yoga is, getting the body a little bit out of the way so the mind can go deeper. And yoking the life and the body to the knowledge, to verify whether the knowledge is really valid or a mistake. And the point is, we have educational institutions, and we pretend veritas and many things we have on our mottos. And people come to 4 years liberal education, the fortunate few who can come for a liberal education, who manage to get a decent lower education, which is not the lower classes. But anyway, other people, they come and they're supposed to liberate their awareness during that upper time. So they should have all of humanity's good ideas available to them. Not just some sort of Western business that is supposedly the only thing that happened on the earth for the last 2,500 years, which is not the case. Now, there are some very interesting things in the West. I'm not totally anti the West, even though I might sound like it, in an attempt to rectify this imbalance, this Euro-American, Eurocentric imbalance. But the plan is to translate the 5,687 Indian commentaries in the Tibetan collection, and then the 1,800 other texts, and then the tens of thousands Tibetan psychonaut treatises, and make these available, and also many things from China and Japan also as well. Actually, my own personal focus is the Indo-Tibetan, and also many things from yoga, from Sufism, from all the world's good knowledge, even oral traditions as well, and have this widely available. We have internet age, information age. Our young people should learn world culture and all the good ideas of the world, and let them all go toe-to-toe. And let them pull together their own insight into the nature of reality. And let's have an education that reflects the plurality of our people. And get out of this notion of that the Anglos are it, because it isn't the case. As one of my kids said the other day at Columbia, they said, Professor Thurman, I was walking across the campus, and I looked over at Butler Library, and you have a point. It looks like a Greek restaurant. Butler Library is at Columbia. It has all just Greek men just across the top. Not a single other person or a woman or from any other culture. So that's my plan. And it might take several generations. I went to Columbia from Amherst, where I was more comfortable, in a beautiful place like Burlington. And I went back to the Rotten Apple, or the Big Apple, to try to make this happen. The starting of such an institution. But it's very hard, because you see what that is planetary global software. In a way, you can get a lot of money from some medical company to go and stick things in some yogis in India or something. I knew a guy at UCLA who claimed he had the fastest rectal thermometer in the West. And because he wanted to explore, yogis have the ability to control their body temperature, and he wanted to explore how, because he thought you could prolong life and retard aging by controlling your body temperature, and he thought you would find some gimmick. But he would never get a nickel to go and study the literature that yogi studied, and how that yogi had conceived of mind and body and reality, to learn to be able to actually control his body temperature in parts of his body. Because we don't respect the intellectual achievements of other civilizations, because we think we're so smart, which is our big delusion. So it's hard to do this. People won't fund it. Our religion department has no funding. They're ready to buy 10 wings full of computers at any time with all the billions that there is, but they won't spend it on exploring these things, really. They think it's some sort of antiquarian thing. They're really very chauvinist. In fact, the sort of overall culture in my university and all these universities. But hopefully, we will be able to infiltrate. slowly but surely. Another question? Yes, ma'am.
How you happen to become a monk and how you are now describe yourself as an ex-monk.
Ex-monk. Well, how it happened was that I was married very young, and then I got identifying with Siddhartha, and then I left that family, and I wanted to attain enlightenment, at the age of 19, 20, and I went over, and eventually I met up with the Tibetans, and I really liked the teachings and texts that I found in their library. And then once you do that, in the Tibetan culture, the way it was, it's like a natural thing to become a monk or a nun, because in that way, if you have this aptitude and desire to study and meditate and make your life that, because the society will it's like you get a lifelong scholarship that way. And you give up, sex, and you give up property, but that's all right, because you have like a lifelong MacArthur. Just sit there and read, and you sublimate all that erotic energy, and you start having visions about the letters on the page, and you feel good. It's all right. And in fact, it's a lot less trouble. You don't have to feel lonely and run out there. And you get as any real monastic will tell you, this sort of notion that everybody has to get out there and moan and groan is not really true. You can have a high level of sensory satisfaction sublimating these energies, definitely, and a high level of health and so on. And so I did that, and then it was actually against the advice of one of my teachers, but the Tibetans who were in their refugee camps, they did it for me, because in their culture that's the natural thing, and their culture has such a huge appreciation of that life form that people will support it in even the most dire circumstances. I mean, it's an amazing thing. The Tibetans refugees in India, they have about 100,000 people approximately, maybe 130 by now, in India and Nepal, and they have over 20, maybe 25,000 monks and nuns. Practically from a fifth to a quarter of the population in exile, when they're of course the monks work and they grow food and they do agricultural work, which they didn't do in Tibet, but it's an amazingly high percentage. But that's because everybody feels that's the best thing you can do with your life, you see. Because you can then develop something. Or even if you personally are not smart enough to develop too much, you're around people who are developing, or you're planting the seeds to develop it in the next life, you see. Even if you're a toughie monk and you just go out and wrestle, you're still saying prayers, Like the 13th Dalai Lama, tried very desperately to get all the toughie monks and get them out and make a defense force to defend. He saw what would be happening with the Chinese, later in the century, in the early part of this century. And he tried to say, look, he went to all the abbots of all the monasteries and said, look, give me the toughie monks and let me have toughie soldiers. Because they're very toughy, those toughie monks, the doptos. And the abbots wouldn't give them up. They said, no, we don't want to have army. We've been getting along for 300 years without an army, and we don't want it, because we don't like the quality of life in our society if we started having a bunch of armies. Those monks would get too big for their britches. They'd come and kick us around. We don't want it, and we'll just pray, and the Buddhas and the fierce angels will keep the other soldiers away. Being naive, and having forgotten, not having been sheltered for too long, really. So they couldn't really muster even a defense force, even taking people who like to fight and wrestle. Because the abbot said, even though they're toughy and they don't study and they don't meditate, they pray a little bit, and they are associated with the monastic robe, and in the future life they'll be good scholars and yogis, and they'll be fine. So, I'm sorry. So then, when I came back to America after that, after some time of trying to be a monk in America, I began to realize that it was useless. I couldn't do anything for anybody in America. And it was even almost selfish. I was happily sitting there reading my things and meditating and feeling all happy. But there was the only refugee community was supporting me. There was no institution like that in America. And it wasn't a respectable way to be. Like my brothers, my mother, my former class, they all thought I was insane. So I would come and say something about, hey, you should really think about this, or control your mind, or take a new attitude about life or death, or whatever I would say. They just thought, oh yeah, that's him. He's nuts. So then I realized after a while that it was that you had to have a form that was like the American form, and then of course, what do we have left of monasticism in America? We have some universities. And then once I got exposed to the reality, then of course, incidentally, I happened to fall in love with someone. And of course, that was the end of me, and that was the beginning of my new phase of my study, my postgraduate study, was learning from the enlightened feminine. And then the children started teaching me. They're still kicking me around. Now the grandchild is going to get on my case. So that's my saga, anyway, in brief. Okay, any other question? Yes, ma'am.
What is the Buddhist explanation for why there is so much suffering?
For why there is? Ignorance. The ignorance of the people who are having the suffering.
Why are we ignorant?
Why? Well, we are ignorant because we are habituated to be ignorant, and because we have not developed wisdom. And beyond that, to keep going like why is not as important as to discover, as to use wisdom to clear it up. You know, in other words, then when you keep going why, then that's bracketed by the idea of the infinity of the past. You know, there's no one is responsible. God did not do it, Buddha said. In fact, as I said, you know, Buddha met God. Buddhists are not atheists. They not only believe in gods, they talk to them all the time. The yogi psychonauts can visit the different heavens and hang out and talk. And Buddha went and he met God, and he said to God, like, why this and that? And God said, well, I'm not really sure. Truth is, it was like a Wizard of Oz. It was like a Wizard of Oz experience, you know. He went to see the great Brahma and Brahma this and Brahma that, and all the other gods were going, oh, Brahma, Brahma. And the Brahma heaven, and Buddha said, like, why did you do it? How did it happen? What was there before there was anything, type of thing? And Brahma was embarrassed at first, and so he said, do you know who I am? Why are you asking me these stupid questions, wasting my time? What are you talking about? So then the monk left, disappointed, you know, because he felt he'd been rude and importuning, and God wouldn't tell him how it all happened. So then as he was leaving, then, like, tutu, what is it, or fro pulls aside the curtain, you know? But God was hipper than that. God himself came out from behind the curtain. He said, look, I didn't tell you because I don't know. I just showed up here one day in the middle of the universe. And then all these other people showed up around me, and they saw me, and they went, Dada, you know? And then I said, I'm not your Dada. I don't know what's going on. And then they said, oh, and they looked like they were be so struck and so stricken with fear that I said, okay, yeah, sure, I'm Dada. It's okay. It's cool. And I didn't answer you because I didn't want to show my ignorance in front of them, because then they'd have identity crises. The other gods. And please, you go find out why. I really want to know too. And then Buddha went, then he found out, and he cleared away the ignorance. And then God came to, then Buddha was being lazy. Actually, he was being a prima donna, actually, as the way the myth goes. And he was sitting there in the forest saying, I'm not going to go teach everybody. I'm having to find a time here in the forest. And anyway, they won't really get it, and who cares? But he didn't mean that. But he was just saying that to get God to come, and God did. Several of them. The old Olympian god, Indra, and also Brahma, the creator god, from India, you know. And they came down, they said, go teach, boys. Nah, I don't want to go teach. He made them ask him about 15 times. And then they said, we happy you teach, because, you know, when life goes bad for people, they blame us. And they're mad at us. And they scapegoat us. Oh, yeah, they worship us when they're all hot and happy. But when it's really bad, they say, damn you, God, you son of a God. And we're sick of that. Imagine billions of people blaming you on millions of planets. Because in the ancient Indian thing, they didn't have this nonsense hanging about this is the only planet and with a few little fuzzy people here. That's ridiculous. There's billions and millions of them all over the place. And they all used to visit when Buddha would teach. They would fly in and park in giant World Trade Center-sized towers made of flower petals that they would hold with mind power across space and come flying across, playing celestial rock and roll. Really. I mean, that's in the ancient sutra. And so the gods did do it, and the main point is that we're co-responsible for our suffering, and the primary person who can really get rid of our suffering is ourselves, and the primary method is by understanding our reality. And then what we realize is, see, the lucky thing is, again, and the final point about that, why is there suffering? The lucky thing is that ultimately there is no suffering. Finally and ultimately. That is to say, suffering is based on delusion, and happiness is based on wisdom and true knowledge. And therefore, although suffering is real, it's like a dream, and people can awaken from it. And the waking is more real, and the happiness is more real. That's why Buddha smiled too. He didn't smile just because he suddenly had understood everything. Everyone else immediately understood everything around him. That didn't happen. And he could tell that in their own view, I'm still miserable. They were sitting there, Where's my Prozac? I'm miserable. I hate everything. Everyone hates me. People were still feeling like that. But he realized that feeling of theirs was a self-conjured delusion. And it was less real than their reality, which was that they are floating in a sea of love. Infinite loving beings, not just one, but infinite loving beings, because there have been infinite beings in the past who have already attained enlightenment. And they love beings on every universe. And that's what, of course, theistic people mean by God as love. Not God as this one guy with a beard who only speaks this one language, but, the infinite loving beings of the universe. They are there. They're waiting just to pop up out of our own nose tip and say, hey, see, we were happy. You're happy. Stop it. Don't freak out. That's why he smiled, you see. And also I think he smiled because he saw that in time, all of the beings that he was involved with, which must be to such a consciousness, this vast number, that they would all have their moment of coming to an awakening from the dream of suffering. Which is quite real when you're in the dream. It's agony. It's not to belittle it. And the compassion of a Buddha is, even though to you that suffering has become a kind of virtual reality, less real than the basic ground of the ocean of bliss that you really feel is the nature of reality itself. But it's less real, and nevertheless it's real to the beings, so you remain aware of them. You remain focused on them. You emanate and incarnate to them to try to bring them some way of waking up. Hold up a mirror to them to help them wake up. And that's sort of the compassion of Buddha through history, which I try to trace in that inner revolution thing I wrote. You start an inner revolution in the minds of beings to try to come to their senses. But you can only smile and do it, and you can only do it effectively when you somehow have such a deep knowledge of time that even though it's not fatalistic, you see how they can be led to get there, and you vow to emanate and to become part of the process that leads them there without ever abandoning them. That is the Bodhisattva's vow. That is the Buddha's constant perseverance, realized in the Buddhist thing by what they call the body of emanation. So anyway, that's the vision they had. Maybe that's enough. Thank you. Thank you.
This is podcast producer Justin Stone Diaz, and I'd like to thank you for tuning in to this extended Robert Thurman Archive podcast bonus, brought to you in part through the generous support of the Tibet House US membership community and listeners like you. To learn more about the benefits of Tibet House membership, please visit their website at tibethouse.us. Tashi Dulek, and thanks for tuning in.